Hey guys, LC Holt here. And this is my update for the week of September the 30th. Can you believe September's almost over with? Anyway, Rebecca Ivey sitting right next to me. And guess what we're going to be talking about today? The thumbnail probably gave it away. We're going to be talking about the Indiana Jones film series. 4 films we got to go through. So we're going to jump right into this. You ready, Beck?
Let's do it.
All right, here we go. So, 1973, George Lucas came up with a film treatment called The Adventures of Indiana Smith.
Yes.
Indiana Smith.
Mr. Smith.
What was Indiana Smith named after, you know?
Well, I know Indiana's his dog.
It was the dog, yeah. It was the same dog that inspired Chewbacca. He used to ride in his passenger seat. He got a lot of wear and tear out of that dog.
That's right. Maybe he needs that dog now.
He might need him for some inspiration. So anyway, George and a guy named Philip Kaufman worked on this treatment together. And Phil Kaufman was a screenwriter and also a director. And they were talking about doing a homage to 1930 serials. They liked those kind of things. Used to run before the main feature in the old days. You get a little serial, little short adventure, and then at the end it would say, you know, Flash Gordon, well, how's it going to end up? We're going to find out next time. And then you would go to the next picture show and you would see another adventure of Flash Gordon. Well, the Flash Gordon he used, of course, for Star Wars.
So he loved his serial ideas.
He did. But this was going to be based more on kind of the adventure serials, not so much the space opera stuff. So he came up with this Indiana Smith. I keep wanting to say Jones because it's so integrated into our consciousness. But Smith is who he was originally. And him and Phil Kaufman sat down and they worked out a script idea, treatment, about Indiana Smith looking for the Ark of the Covenant. Now,
he could have called it Indiana Smith Goes to the Ark, you know, because the Mr. Smith movies.
Right, exactly.
Sorry. Joke.
But anyway, but Kaufman came up with the idea of the Ark of the Covenant, using that as a plot device. Because that was one of the key things with all of these Indiana Jones movies is that you had to have a MacGuffin, something he was going to go after. And it had to be strong. So Kaufman came up with this idea, well, what if we do the Ark of the Covenant? That sounds interesting, and Lucas liked it. But the problem was Philip Kaufman had to go off and direct a Clint Eastwood movie called The Outlaw Josie Wales. So he wasn't available to work on the script anymore. And George Lucas had this other project he'd been kicking around called Star Wars. So they put aside Indiana Smith for now, and George Lucas went off and did Star Wars. Now, Indiana Smith reared his head once more after the original Star Wars film came out, May of 1977. Lucas went on vacation, a much-needed rest after the production of Star Wars. It was, a big hit at this point, and he went to Hawaii. And while he was in Hawaii, he saw his old buddy Steven Spielberg was there shooting a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And so during some off time, they were down on the beach, and Spielberg happened to just mention offhand, you know what I'd really like to do, George? George said, what? And Spielberg said, I'd really like to do a James Bond movie. And Lucas, being George Lucas, was like, I got something even better. You don't need James Bond. Let me tell you this story about this guy named Indiana Smith. He's an archaeologist. And Spielberg says, Indiana Smith, that sounds horrible. And George goes, oh, okay, Jones. Like Spielberg's like, yeah. And that apparently is how the name was changed. Spielberg didn't like the Smith thing. So that's how Indiana Jones was born, right there on that beach in Hawaii. But Lucas had already at that point decided he was doing a couple more Star Wars films. He told Spielberg, I don't want to direct this thing. I'll write it and I'll produce it. You know, it's from my story with Phil Kaufman, who gets story credit in the final film that was made. But he said, I want you to do it. I want you to do it, Steve. You're going to direct this. And not only are you going to direct this movie, you're going to do 2 more.
Because I said so.
That's right. Lucas apparently told Spielberg, don't even commit to the first one if you don't want to do 3, because you're doing 3. And Spielberg was, he said, okay, well, we'll see what we can come up with script-wise. So In 1978, little less than a year later, George and Spielberg got together with a guy, a screenwriter who George had hired to work on the next Star Wars movie, a guy named Lawrence Kasdan. And they, for about, I don't know, a few days, 9 hours every day, they recorded themselves talking into a tape recorder, all kinds of ideas about what you could do with Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant. And this was then typed up as a transcript that was given to Mr. Kasdan. And Mr. Kasdan went away with the transcript, and he wrote over the course of about 6 months the first draft of a movie called Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now, you know, the first draft is pretty close to what they spitballed a lot of ideas. In fact, they spitballed too many ideas because they had to cut a lot of the ideas out of Raiders. Spielberg had this idea. He wanted Indiana at one point to be chased by a boulder. So they're like, okay, throw that in. And then there was another one. Lucas really wanted there to be a sequence on a submarine. He was like, I don't know how he gets on the submarine. Figure that out, Larry, will you? And Larry, you know, kind of figured it out. So they had that. But they had some disagreements over the Indiana Jones character. Would you like to know some of these disagreements?
Sure.
Spielberg wanted him to be an alkie.
Yeah, I'd heard that.
Yeah, wanted him to be an alcoholic, and he wanted him to be a little bit more like a playboy, like a James Bond type guy. Because, again, this goes back to the idea of him wanting to do a James Bond movie. And Lucas was like, no, he's an academic. He's an adventurer. He's not James Bond.
And he slings a couple back after Marion disappears.
Yeah, and that's about as close as you get to the alcoholic subtext. Probably Spielberg was like, he's going to be an alcoholic in this scene, George. But we were talking about this before. I think what made these first 3 films so good is these guys batted back these ideas, you know, between each other. I'm talking about Spielberg and George Lucas. Mm-hmm. And they would reject each other's ideas. Mm-hmm. Or they would do like a trade-off, you know. And there were several times.
Can't always have a yes man.
That's right. That's right. And you had 2 really creative people who were both extremely successful. So they both, I'm sure, had a measure of ego, didn't want to back down. So they had to start making compromises. Like, okay, George, he can be an adventurer. That's fine. He'll be a bookworm. And
okay, Stephen, we'll let him get loaded in that one scene.
Exactly. And that's how you make magic. We just demonstrated it for you. They started filming this thing over in France, Raiders, in June of 1980. And they moved to Elstree Studios, which is over in London, England. That's where they did like Marion's Bar and also the Well of Souls. You know how many snakes they had in the Well of Souls?
How many?
They had 7,000 snakes. And then they had these like rubber snakes. And the rubber snakes were all hooked up to these levers, like these cranks. Mm-hmm. I'm in a noisy chair, pardon me. In these cranks, and so these guys would pull these levers, and these snakes would like go. Some would go this way, some would go that way. And Spielberg had these snakes on top. Originally, it was fewer snakes, and he started looking at the scene. And when the guys would pull the lever, all the snakes would go that way, and then this way. So it looked like they were dancing. And he was like, "We can't have dancing snakes. Get more snakes." And so they wound up with these things that I didn't even know what they're called, but they're legless lizards, and they only come from a certain part, and they grow very, very long. They look like a snake, except they have eyelids and they have ear holes, which snakes do not have. But if you have a lot of real snakes in there, and you throw a bunch of these legless lizards, it looks like there's even more snakes. So they filled it out with a lot of these legless lizards.
How did the legless lizards work with the snakes? Did they work well together?
The snakes ate them. Yeah, I mean, the snakes would just eat the legless lizards. But I guess, you know, what can you do, right? They had one venomous snake. Most of them were pythons and stuff like that. They had a cobra. And they owned...
famous with the...
Yeah.
They had the glass between them.
They had a piece of glass between Harrison Ford where he falls down. The cobra rears up. Of course, the cobra's not aware the glass is there, so it's thinking, I'm going to bite you in the face, Han Solo. And Harrison jumps back, you know, and then they do it again with Marion, and then she jumps up into his arms. But, yeah, I mean, it's infamous, like you were saying, that you can see the reflection of the snake, the cobra, in the glass partition. You couldn't really on VHS.
No.
But now that we got all high def with everything, Blu-rays and stuff.
It's ruining all the old effects.
Yeah. I bet George, you know what? I bet George has probably gone in there and taken that reflection out.
He's put Hayden Christensen in.
It's a reflection of Hayden Christensen. That's for the real fans, because we all know everybody loves Hayden Christensen. They couldn't shoot in Egypt, this movie. So you know where they went? Star Wars connection. Tanzania. And everybody got sick in Tanzania.
Again.
Yep. It was, George just, and then
he didn't learn.
Never learned. Then he went back for those prequels, remember? Went back to Tanzania. Well, so many people got sick on this movie. The director of photography got sick. Spielberg refused to eat the food in Tanzania. He brought canned food from England, and that's what he ate. So he didn't get sick. Harrison Ford got sick, and that led to one of the more famous scenes in the movie, where Indiana Jones is facing down this guy who wants to do like a big routine with a sword, and Indiana Jones just shoots him.
Yeah.
And there was supposed to be a big fight between, sword versus gun. And Harrison Ford was so sick, you know this story.
Yes.
That he said, look, George, why don't I just shoot him? And so, well, he said to Steve, not George was probably having a drink in California.
That's right.
Because he's like, I'm not going there and getting sick. Steve, you do that. Why don't you? Huh?
Take one for the team.
Yeah, take one for the team. All he is. I'll be over here having a martini with Chewbacca. But he goes and he just pulls the gun out and he shoots the guy, and it leads to a very funny scene, and it's much better, I'm sure, than what they had scripted. Even though I'm sure it was a big, exciting fight and everything. But that kind of says a lot about the Indiana Jones character, and I wanted to talk to you for a minute about Indy as a character, because I think what makes him so interesting is the fact that he isn't a superhero. He makes bad decisions sometimes, and he gets beat up, and he's not always on top of the situation. And sometimes the fun of these movies is figuring out how he's going to get out of this impossible situation. And I think when you have Indiana Jones, the best stuff, the best material, a lot of times comes from the fact that he's just an academic.
Mm-hmm.
George had the right idea. What do you think?
I do too. Yeah. Yeah. And also I should point out Harrison also got beat up a lot on this film, doing his own stunt work.
And in the sequel, we'll talk about that here momentarily. He got very beat up on that. So Spielberg was so fed up with Tanzania, they were going to shoot for 6.5 weeks there. He was like, let's do 4. So they started to condense things and also improvise stuff. Some very interesting stuff came out of their improvisations because they were just ready to get out. Everybody was sick. Now, after the fact, they did some repair to the movie. There were a few things that, like for instance, Marion Ravenwood, who's played by Karen Allen in the film. Originally, she didn't have a scene at the end with Indiana. The last time you saw her was after the, as we like to call them, the ARC people killed the Nazis.
The ARC people, yes.
Which, if you've seen the movie, you know what we're talking about. They get the ARC, they take it to an island, the Nazis, they open this thing up. And when they open this thing up, the ARC people come out, and they're all beautiful and everything. They turn like into creatures. And then one of my favorite bits is when the guy, this is such a Spielberg thing, when the Nazi guy is filming it and one goes through the camera lens and then through his head.
Yeah.
That's a Spielberg idea. And then after that, God cleans up his mess, which I thought was great.
He's very tidy, God.
Shoots him right up into the heavens. Thing falls back down, the lid of the ARC, and boom. They take it, the government takes it, sticks it in a warehouse, which is apparently Area 51. Don't go there. You'll be shot. That's a more contemporary side.
Yeah.
But we don't know it's Area 51 in this movie.
Yeah.
But the last time you saw Marion in the original cut of the film was when they were, right after the Nazis were killed by God. And so they went back in San Francisco, actually, doubling for the steps of Washington, D.C., and shot a new scene that would resolve that sort of storyline. Tell you what happened to her. They kiss, and Indiana says, the fools, they don't know what they have there. And then you see them taking them.
I know what I have.
Exactly. And then she disappears for a while,
Yeah.
but she'll be back. And that kind of leads us not to her return, but to the return of Indiana Jones in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Death, because that was the original title.
Yeah.
It was actually Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom eventually. So Lucas, as I said before, was always intending for there to be 3. Spielberg has gone on record after the fact as saying, George told me he had all 3 stories.
That's what he tells all of us.
Yeah, George likes everybody to think that he's got it all figured out beforehand. But Spielberg,
it's on a napkin somewhere.
Yeah, and Spielberg said, he was just conning me because he had no other story, so we had to start from scratch. Lucas wanted to avoid Nazis this time out. He wanted to do, and we'll come back to this, because this is one of those George Lucas ideas, that he is not satisfied until he has a damn haunted castle in Scotland. He wanted it to be set in a haunted castle in Scotland. And it was going to be a haunted castle movie. Now, how that relates to archaeology is beyond me. But sometimes George gets in his head. Last night on Turner Movie Classics, which didn't exist at the time, I saw something, and let's make Indiana Jones into that. So Spielberg was like, I don't really like the haunted castles. Could we do a demonic temple? And George was like, okay. But he files away this haunted castle idea. Originally, they wanted to shoot it in China. But the Chinese people heard that they had a motorcycle chase on the Great Wall and were like, hell no, you're not coming here. And so they had to they refused permission. They had to go back and redo that entirely. Lucas devised this story about black magic. And he wanted to set it in, now they couldn't shoot in China, in India, and use the sort of Hindu philosophy or religion. That caused a lot of problems because traditionally people of that faith do not care for this movie. Mm-hmm. They find it a little offensive. Mm-hmm. George went on record as saying someone mentioned this when they were preparing it. And said, well, what if India doesn't want you to shoot there because this is their religion and they might not dig this whole thing, the Kali Ma and all that. And George was like, well, it's me and Steve. They'll love it. Well, they didn't love it, so they couldn't shoot in India. They actually shot in Sri Lanka. And so anyway, Kasdan was another one who didn't like this idea. They offered it to him to direct. He said, this is a mean story. This is really nasty. I don't want to do that. So he turned it down. And so George went to his old buddies, Willard Huck and Gloria Katz, who had written American Graffiti and Howard the Duck. I think I mention that every time we talk about it.
We love to talk about Howard the Duck.
We do. And so anyway, they wrote a draft of the script based on a treatment that George had come up with. And they got to take some of the things from Raiders they wanted to put in there and put it into this one. Like there was a mine chase. They wanted to do a mine car chase. They stuck it in this movie. There was a scene they had written for Raiders where they're on a plane and they had to figure out how to get out of the plane because the pilots have already parachuted out. And so they go out on a raft. That was in Raiders. They used it instead in this movie. So there were a lot of things they just kind of shifted over. There were a lot of other dog names in this because Spielberg had a Cocker Spaniel.
I was going to say Spielberg's dog.
Yeah, named Willie. And so when it came time to name the female lead, they named her after the dog, Willie Scott. And then
was it because Lucas's dog and Spielberg's dog got together in real life?
I don't know, but I know Spielberg and Willie got together.
Some,
they were Kate Capshaw is his wife to this day, and he met her on the set of this movie. Willard Huck, he donated his dog's name, Short Round, And then that became the little boy, the sidekick. Now, as I said before, they had to shoot in Sri Lanka as opposed to India because the government found the script offensive. They also shot again at Elstree Studios in London. As you were saying before, Ford got hurt. Harrison Ford, there's a scene in this movie where they're in this castle-looking thing, not a haunted one in Scotland, but in India. And this guy, assassin, attacks Harrison Ford from behind, has a garrote around his neck, and he's struggling with the guy. And the assassin kind of flips Harrison Ford, and Harrison Ford does this kind of somersault, lands on his butt on the floor. Well, when he did it, he did his own stunts in this up to a certain point. And when he did that stunt, he herniated a spinal disc, which doesn't sound very fun. And it was so bad he couldn't stand up. So they had to take him for surgery in the middle of the shoot, but they couldn't stop the production. So for 5 weeks, the stuntman, Vic Armstrong, stood in for Indiana Jones. Vic Armstrong did a lot of Bond movies, very famous stuntman. And in all the wide shots of like the fight at the end on the conveyor belt, that's all Vic Armstrong. Because Harrison was getting back surgery and he was recovering from that. Pretty much any wide shot of Indiana Jones in the movie where he's doing something physical in the Temple of Doom is Vic. And what they did was when Harrison came back, they shot close-ups to plug in, you know. But luckily, Vic Armstrong was a close enough body double to Harrison Ford that I never really knew.
I wouldn't have, yeah.
Yeah, that he wasn't in really that much of the movie. Like some stuff, the mine shaft chase I was telling you, but that was done with miniatures.
Yeah.
So yeah, other than, you know, plugged in close-ups, all of them were not there for that. So there were a lot of things they could do in this time period. But it is kind of a bummer when your star is literally unavailable to be there because they can't stand up. But that wouldn't be the first time Harrison Ford hurt himself on a movie. In fact, these days it seems like he can't walk onto a set.
Yeah, now they're like, just stand there.
Yeah.
Don't even open a door anymore.
Please don't move. We have an insurance bond on this thing. Stop it.
You're brittle.
But you know what, though? They made it on budget and schedule.
Wow.
In spite of all that. Under budget and schedule, actually, because that was a big thing for Spielberg. He had done a movie, the title of which I won't mention out of courtesy to him, because I don't think he's very proud of it, but a movie that had gone way over budget. And when he did the first Indy, he said, I want to prove to a studio that I can stay on budget and on schedule. So all of these Indiana Jones movies were all about him proving we can make things that are successful, that can be brought in on time and on, you know, the budget that you give us. The budget on this was a little higher than the first one. Still not huge, you know, but I mean, George owned ILM, so it's not like, you know.
He could give him a discount, you know.
That's right. That's right. So they wrapped in August of '83, and this movie came out in May of '84. But a lot of the ILM stuff, like the mine chase and stuff, that takes time. Optical stuff put in. But a lot of these stunts were done on location by real people. You know, trucks being driven by truck drivers. Great stuff like that. And that's one of the problems I have with the fourth film, which we'll get to here shortly. Now, the first cut of this movie came in at about, I think it was like an hour and 45 minutes. And they determined, watching it, George and Steven, they looked at each other and they had a moment that you're not going to hear too often in filmmaking. They said, this movie goes way too fast. And what they realized was it was so fast-paced that they felt the audience wouldn't have a time to catch their breath.
That's very surprising for George.
Yes.
Because it's his slogan.
Fast and more intense. This movie, even for him, was too fast and too intense. So they actually went back in and added scenes that would slow things down, which you're not going to see too often in filmmaking. But that was the case here. The release of the film, much was said about the controversy, not just amongst the Hindu community and the Indian community, but amongst parents who took their children to see the movie. And they realized that it was a lot more violent than the previous one, which Raiders had some violent stuff. You know, when the people's faces melt off, when the dude's head blew up, that's pretty violent for a PG movie. But I don't think the parents were quite prepared for, the hand going into the chest and ripping the heart out.
Yeah.
Temple of Doom had horror aspects, I think it's safe to say. And it actually led to the creation of the PG-13 rating, because they said this movie is too intense for a PG. But Spielberg basically said, you're not giving my movie an R because that limits the market. And
only for Spielberg.
At that time in the 80s, Spielberg could say, look, you're not giving my movie an R. And they would go, oh, okay. And they go off like that. But yeah, so that's how the PG-13 rating.
You still had all those snakes from the first film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before that, it was 2 months after the movie came out that the first PG-13, but it was partly because of this film and the amount of violence. And Spielberg even later said he would never make the movie the same way. He said that he was going through a divorce at that time, and George Lucas was going through a divorce. So according to Spielberg, the ill feelings brought about by their mutual divorces caused the dark atmosphere of the movie. And he said later that if I had it to do again, it would not be so violent and so dark. When I was a kid, honestly, it was just another Indiana Jones movie. I didn't really take it as... Now, I've had some time, and I watched it not too long ago. And watching it again, I thought, there's some intense stuff in here. The pulling the heart out, the holding it up, and the heart catching on fire as the guy screams his way down into the lava. Pretty intense for a Spielberg movie. And maybe even for George, because we all know he only makes children's films.
He's so bitter about it.
But for more on that, go to our Star Wars series. Yeah. But anyway, so many years passed. That was a very successful movie in spite of the controversy, or maybe because of it. But so that was in 84? 5 years, almost to the day before the next Indiana Jones movie came out. And what was that film? Indiana Jones and... The Last Crusade.
Last Crusade.
What do you think about that one?
I like it.
Yeah?
I like that one.
What was the thing that... We'll go into it here in a second, but what was the thing that you liked most about it?
I liked that they had Sean Connery playing the dad. I liked the whole relationship between Indy and his father. I liked that the Nazis were back. And we've got another scary religious item they're searching for. I know some people say, it's kind of a rehash of Raiders to an extent, but I think they did it in such, in a new way. Yeah. That I enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah. This was the first one I saw in the theater, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I mean, Spielberg, and actually a lot of those things that you mentioned were not a part of the original development of the story. This one has kind of an interesting backstory, because the original script for this was very different. It was not called Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I should mention that Spielberg wanted to finish this trilogy. Like, his big thing was, by the end of the 80s, I want to be done with Indiana Jones. So he pushed aside two very well-known projects in order to focus on finishing the Indy films. One of them was a film that was written by his sister called Big, which went on to star Tom Hanks. Huge thing. He was nominated. Penny Marshall directed it ultimately. Another movie he turned down to work on this was Rain Man.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He was originally going to direct that one, which another classic, directed by someone else. So didn't hurt the films, but he said, I want to do this, so I'm going to have to put those projects aside, even though my sister wrote one of them, and I really want to do them both. Guess what Lucas wanted the film to be about? I'll give you a hint. It had to do with Scotland.
Well, he got something from Scotland into it.
By God, he finally got into this. He wanted this movie, yet again, to be about a haunted castle in Scotland. Well, I think Steve was just so sick of hearing about this damn haunted castle. He's like, we're going to set a scene in a castle, and there's going to be a guy pretending to be Scottish in the scene. Okay, George? And George is like, really? Yeah. But originally the
Spielberg's like, stop watching Scooby-Doo, okay?
yeah, exactly. Well, let me tell you this. Some of those elements you were talking about that you like, the Holy Grail. You know what Spielberg said when George Lucas said, I think the prologue of this movie should be Indiana Jones going after the Holy Grail? Spielberg said that's a stupid idea. He said that Holy Grail is a terrible thing to go after. I am not interested in that. So Lucas was like, oh, okay. Well, how about the Monkey King? And Spielberg was like, what the hell is that?
You need like puppets. You need like a George puppet.
I know, because I'm basically playing out scenes between them that theoretically happened. So what George said is, how about the Fountain of Youth?
Mm-hmm.
And Spielberg was like, okay, we'll work with that for a while. So Spielberg brought on a screenwriter named Chris Columbus. You may have known him as being a writer of Gremlins, which is a movie that Spielberg produced. He also did one that I know me and you like a lot called Only the Lonely,
yes,
with John Candy. And then he went on to become a really famous director in his own right. He did the first two Home Alone movies. He did the first Harry Potter. Chris Columbus, everybody knows, But at this time, he was a struggling screenwriter who had just written Gremlins for Spielberg. So they hired him to write the third Indiana Jones movie, and he did 2 drafts for them. And in this version of the movie, Indiana Jones was going to go to Africa, to Mozambique, and he was going to meet a Katharine Hepburn type character. I think her name was Dr. Claire Clark. Strong woman, kind of earthy, like Hepburn. And they were going to find in Mozambique a 200-year-old pygmy. And they wanted to know how this person could live this long. And so then the Nazis show up, of course, and they kidnap this pygmy, 200-year-old guy. And they take him and they say, you're going to find for the Fuhrer the Fountain of Youth. And so Indiana Jones and this female historian, go after to try and rescue this pygmy guy that's ancient, practically. And then at the end of the movie, they find the Fountain of Youth. Indiana Jones gets shot and killed. And then the Monkey King shows up and resurrects Indiana Jones. And he defeats the Nazis. And the primary villain in this script, the main Nazi commander, had a mechanical arm, like a sort of James Bondy. Yeah, it's like a James Bondy type thing, and like Jaws from the Bond movies, type of Nazi. And he was going to drink from the Fountain of Youth because he thought it would give him eternal life. And because his soul and heart was impure, it took life from him. And so he withered away. That part might sound familiar. Because of that script, that's about the only thing that survived. All the rest of the stuff about the Fountain of Youth, Mozambique, the Monkey King, eventually was thrown out because Steven Spielberg didn't like this script. And he wanted to introduce, this was his idea, Spielberg's. He said, I want to introduce Indiana Jones's father. I want it to be a father-son story. And Lucas was like, okay. I tell you what, if we put a father in there, can I have the Holy Grail? And Spielberg was like, yeah, okay. Back to compromise. So that's how they got with that. Now, Jeffrey Boehm was hired to rewrite the script from scratch. Jeffrey Boehm wrote The Lost Boys. And he also wrote another film for Spielberg called Inner Space, which I'm sure you probably know. He wrote a new draft of the script. And the thing that he contributed, Boehm, was, who has recently passed away a few years back, sadly. But he contributed this idea that let's have the film be about the father-son relationship. And if we have the Holy Grail in there, let's use that as a metaphor of the thing that would draw the father and son together. The way, say, like coming home for a funeral would bring a father and son together. Well, we'll have an adventure story instead, but it'll be the Holy Grail. But the primary focus of the script I want to write is about father-son. And Spielberg, I'm sure, was like, of course, because that's exactly what he wanted. And I'm sure Lucas was like, George, okay, yeah, I don't know about that, but we'll try it. So that's how we got it. And then Spielberg got the Bond connection in there. You know how he did that?
Yes.
He hired
Sean Connery.
Sean freaking Connery. So that way, and which makes no sense actually if you think about it, because Sean Connery and Harrison Ford there's 12 years of difference. So there's no way Sean Connery could be Harrison Ford's father. But he's got gray hair and Harrison's hair is dark in the movie. So you can kind of go with it. And plus he's James Bond, You believe anything James Bond says.
That's right. Yes.
So they started shooting this May 16th of 1988 in Spain. And Harrison Ford actually suggested they had a scene. They eventually came up with a scene instead of the prologue that they originally wanted to do. Now that they have the Holy Grail as the primary thing, they needed a new prologue. So they came up with this idea of what if we show Indiana Jones as a kid? This ultimately led to an entire television series. Mm-hmm. But in the film prologue, they needed someone to play Indiana Jones. And Harrison Ford had just done a movie with Peter Weir, written by Paul Schrader, called The Mosquito Coast, where he played a guy who takes his family into the jungle and forces them to live there against their will, and he's kind of crazy. It was a Paul Schrader script. It's a guy falling apart mentally. But the kid that played his son in that movie was River Phoenix. And Harrison Ford told Spielberg, he said, of everybody I've ever met, this kid probably is most like me when I was younger. So he played my son in this movie. He kind of looks like, he could be related to me. So why doesn't he play me as a kid? And Spielberg was like, okay, cool. Because River Phoenix was very well known as being a talented young actor based on many, many performances he had already given, even at that age. Again, another one we lost sadly too soon. But he played Indiana Jones as a Boy Scout in this little opening adventure, which doesn't really have anything to do with the film coming up, other than it's a cool adventure of Indiana Jones as a boy. So that was how River got into the movie. Spielberg came up with a lot of things that were incorporated into the script as they were shooting. Like he originally in the script, how Indy goes to finally get into the little temple thing. These things all have temples in them. Yeah. But the temple with the Holy Grail is you have to go through a couple different tests. Originally, I think it was like one test. And Spielberg said, let's do 3. And so the
magic number.
That's right. And he came up with what those 3 tests would be, that you would have to spell Jehovah. Remember, it begins with an I. Mm-hmm. And then you would have to, kneel, because the penitent man always kneels and the blades go over. And then there was the really clever one, which was the forced perspective bridge. Yeah. It's a leap of faith. It looks like you're about to fall down a chasm if you step forward. But if you take a leap of faith, there's actually a forced perspective bridge there. That is really clever. Mm-hmm. And again, that's one of those things that Spielberg, he came up with the forced perspective thing. But beyond that, they actually reshot some stuff there, because originally in the script, when he steps on the J instead of the I, a tarantula came up his leg. And they had that in the original cut. They looked at it and they were like, we had a lot of bugs in that last one. And this tarantula doesn't look too frightening. So they're like, what if he just falls in a hole? So at the last minute, they shot a stuntman falling through a hole and put it into the movie, which is kind of cool because you think about those 3 trials. I always think about that. Yeah. Other things that he wanted to innovate. There is a scene that is very reminiscent at the end of this film of the ending of Raiders, mm-hmm. where, the Nazis in that movie open up the Ark, they melt, their heads explode. Well, at the end of this movie, taking from Chris Columbus's script, the character of Donovan, the villain, who's not really a Nazi, but he's certainly a sympathizer, takes what he believes is the chalice of Christ. You like how I like that?
Oh, yes, good. That was real good.
Yeah. And, the knight says you have to choose wisely, because if you don't.
And he lets old homegirl choose it.
That's right, which Allison Doody. Never trust a woman named Doody. She's Elsa in the movie.
Yes.
But he dips this chalice into the water and takes a sip, Donovan. And suddenly his life begins to drain out of him, because if you chose poorly, it takes your life away. It doesn't give it to you.
He chose poorly.
Damn right. Because he just withered away. And Spielberg, this was pre-CGI. Spielberg's like, I want this to look different than the guy whose face melted in Raiders. So is there any way we could do Donovan turning to a skeleton in one shot? And this was the start of morphing technology. because they figured out how to create 3 different skeletons that each went through a different phase of deterioration. It would like sink into itself, the hair would fall out, but they couldn't. He didn't want to like cut to Duty going and then cut to the next phase, and then cut to Indy going ooh, and then cut to the next phase, and then cut to the Night going He wanted to see it all in one shot. So they figured out a way to morph these 3 puppets so that it looked like you just saw Donovan turn into like a shriveled up little raisin and fall against the wall.
Skeleton that explodes.
That's right, because Allison pushes him away. She's like,
"Ew.
Get off me, you freak." And then he explodes into dust against the wall. So already we're getting some computer technology going, but we haven't gotten nuts with it yet.
No.
You want to get nuts? We're going to get nuts.
All right, Michael Keaton.
But so anyway, this movie came out, broke Memorial Day records.
All right, Barbara Walters. You went from Michael Keaton to Barbara Walters.
I'm going to throw you off the view in any moment now.
Okay.
Listen here, Elizabeth. But so anyway, so it broke all these records, and it was only beaten later by Ghostbusters 2 and Batman. 2 very well.
That summer was busy.
That was a busy summer. And 1989 was a big moneymaker for the studios, and Paramount got their share with The Last Crusade. Now, the final shot of The Last Crusade was one added after the fact. Spielberg wanted to have the classic shot of the heroes riding off into the sunset, which he captured in glorious color. Technicolor. Not Technicolor, actually, just color. 1980s color. Die Hard color. But anyway, so that was meant to be the end of the story. Sadly, it wasn't. If only that had been the end of the story.
It would have been a perfect trilogy.
It would have. And I still say it is.
Okay,
because
we don't count the
That's right.
fourth one.
We don't count the one we're about to talk about. Shame you for saying the name Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It took a long time to get here. I remember hearing about this movie for years. Mm-hmm. Long before I ever heard that title, I heard about them getting ready to make this movie.
And I remember Harrison Ford interviews. He was always saying, I'd play him again in a heartbeat. They would say, do you want to play Han Solo? He's like, no. What about Indy? Oh, heartbeat. I would definitely play Indy.
He much preferred Indiana Jones. And we've talked about this. It's because Han he thought that character ended, right?
Yes.
Like when Empire, that was like the end of the
What more can you do with him?
Right. Indiana Jones, he could theoretically go on any number of adventures. The only problem is the thing that happens to us, all of us, is that we age, like we start getting gray in our hair. And
you get osteoporosis.
Right. And like shit starts to get fragile, as we know about Harrison, because now everything seems to be fragile on him. But hey, he's an older guy. So they were already thinking while they were making Indiana Jones 3 that maybe we should wrap this sucker up. Mm-hmm. Well, Lucas didn't want to wrap it up. He made a whole TV series about the young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
Harrison made like a little...
He did. He was in an episode. And this was actually what got them thinking about doing a 4th Indiana Jones movie.
Because you had them all different ages in that show.
That's right. Because you had the ultra old Indy, who was played by an actor. I'm not sure who that was. And then you had the Harrison Ford Indiana Jones, who was like in the 50s. And that started George Lucas thinking, wait, what a second. 50s, Indiana Jones, maybe we could explore this in a movie and make more money, Memorial Day records. So
now they're going to have to set it in the 60s.
Yeah.
If they keep waiting, it's going to be Indiana Jones goes to see Star Wars.
Right. Well, now we're going to launch in. Let's launch out of that and into what became the 4th film. The 4th film originally began in George Lucas's mind as a homage to 1950s science fiction films. Again, sort of like the ghost in the Scottish castle, you go, what in hell does this have to do with archaeology? And that's what Harrison Ford said as well. He said, what does this have to do with archaeology? He actually told George Lucas, I'm not going to be in a Spielberg alien movie.
And
he was not interested. And so what George Lucas did was Harrison Ford had done a movie called The Fugitive. It was written by a guy named Jeb Stewart. Harrison Ford really liked that movie. So George was like, I'm going to hire Jeb Stewart to write it, and then he'll like it. Well, that's not really what happened.
Because you still have aliens.
It's still aliens. And can you get, well, you know what the name of this movie was under George Lucas, the original title.
I'll let you say it. It was just
Indiana Jones and the Saucer Men.
Which kind of made me think of, Santa Claus versus the Martians.
Very,
doesn't it make you?
Yeah, it's like, when you hear Indiana Jones and the Saucer Men, I at least for me, I go, B movie, wouldn't watch it.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like a winner to me.
I mean, I know that was his thing. Like, yeah, that's what we're going to do. But it just doesn't seem.
No.
It's a square peg.
It doesn't fit. And that's what Harrison Ford kept saying, and Spielberg. And this went on for a long time. They got Jeffrey Boehm, the writer of 3, to write a script for it after the Jeb Stewart one didn't turn out to George Lucas's liking, because by this point, it was all about George Lucas's liking. Eventually, a movie called Independence Day came along. And when that came along, I think Spielberg saw it as an opportunity of saying to George, giving him a good excuse not to do the movie, because he was like, George, we can't do an alien movie. Independence Day just came out. And George kind of agreed. So I think he thought that ended the alien thing. Little did he know, George would go off and do...
George is like a dog with a bone.
He is. He's like Indiana the dog with a bone. And, Steven went off and did his movies. George went off and did the Star Wars prequels. Eventually, Spielberg brought the idea of Indiana Jones up again. And it was because his kids asked him, apparently, Dad, when are you going to make another Indiana Jones movie? And Spielberg was like, well, we've been talking about that. And I'm sure in his mind, he's thinking, oh, God, I got to get George off those aliens. But he thought about making it then. And then he went back to George Lucas, who by this point was bitter, who was very bitter and very angry, thanks to those prequels and the fan reaction. And he said, so we should do another Indiana Jones movie, George. What do you think? And I'm sure he was hoping that George had forgotten about aliens. And George was sitting there, and he was probably thinking, I'm putting all these words in their mouths.
That's why you need your puppets.
I know. George was thinking, you know what? These fans didn't like what I did with Star Wars. Tell you what, I'm going to do the worst possible thing I could possibly do with Indiana Jones, just to spite you. So he said, Steven, I got a great idea about Indiana Jones, and it involves aliens. And Steven's like, oh, God, no, not aliens.
Why
Anything.
didn't Steven Spielberg just go, let's just set it in a Scottish castle?
Yeah. It's like, that Scottish castle idea you had? We didn't really do that. So could we go back to that? Because at least we could get like an artifact in there. And that's what he said to George Lucas. He said, if you can ground this in some sort of an archaeological thing, then maybe we could figure something out. And George goes, crystal skulls.
Okay. I was going to say, Spielberg's like, Henry Winkler's not playing Indiana Jones.
Right.
We need.
Well, we should say that Harrison is getting older as all these years go by.
Yes.
They brought in, he's getting, we started in the late 80s. Now we're getting up to like The Sixth Sense, 99, because M. Night Shyamalan was hired to write one of these drafts of many. And Shyamalan later said...
Twist ending.
That's right. He's really not an archaeologist. He's just the crazy person in an institution. That's what we find out at the end. All of this was a delusion. It was like Shutter Island with Indiana Jones. But eventually Shyamalan came out later. I mean, it's weird for me to say this because it sounds like Shyamalan really saved himself, because that would have been a terrible script. I mean, I'm sorry, Shyami, but it probably would have been terrible.
Knows him personally.
I do. Night. I spell it with correctly, though, not like the Oscars where they stuck the K on it when it said Academy Award nominated. But that's a real deep trivia thing there. I'm sure nobody remembers that. But they misspelled his name at the Oscars, and they cut to his face, and he's like, what? It's the only time I'll ever be nominated, and you misspell my name. But he said he couldn't get any of the three of them to focus or agree on anything. So he ultimately backed out. Shyamalan did. And I don't know who dodged the bullet there. But they got Frank Darabont. Now, I am a big fan of Frank Darabont. Mm-hmm. I think he is a great writer. And what I love most about him is he concentrates on story. He wrote a few drafts of this. And his version was called Indiana Jones and the City of the Gods. And it was set in the 50s. and it had some alien type stuff around the edges, but primarily it was set in South America amongst the Aztec temples, and the villains were escaped Nazi war criminals who historically escaped to South America.
See,
that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, George heard that and was like, that's too good an idea, Frank. We're not using that. Spielberg loved the Frank Darabont script. Let me say that again. Spielberg loved the Frank Darabont script. And why would you trust the taste of someone like Spielberg, George? I mean, we all know Lucas has the best ideas. How could you possibly get a loser like Spielberg and not trust his opinion? And I think what
did Harrison think of it?
Probably he was just like, guys, I'm getting fucking old. Like, come decide on something. Because remember when I said originally when he was younger, his point of view was
originally when he was younger.
Yeah, like all the many years ago, 20 years prior, he was saying, "Well, I'm not going to be in a Steven Spielberg alien movie." Well, at this point, he's like not even arguing about it. Apparently,
he's like, if I'm going to do this,
he's like, I just got on Social Security, guys, and I want to play this character again. So could you figure something out? And so anyway, so they lost the Darabont script because George Lucas had to bitch about it. He was like, this has dialogue that's not clunky. We can't do this, Steve. And so Steven was like, okay, George, I'll tell you what, I'll bring in a couple of my writers, which is what Spielberg did. Sadly, it didn't help. He brought in a guy named Jeff Nathanson, who had written Catch Me If You Can for him. Good script, good movie. And then he brought in who Spielberg calls his closer, a guy named David Koepp. David Koepp rewrote Jurassic Park, wrote The Lost World, wrote War of the Worlds for Spielberg. He's what Spielberg refers to him as his closer, because whenever he has a script that's not quite right, he can bring Koepp in, and Koepp will do the final polish of it, and then that's the way he shoots. Koepp should have polished this turd more, because it was not very good. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I heard that they wanted to bring Sean Connery back.
They did.
He was like, no.
He had retired by the time all this tomfoolery. Harrison Ford got old and Sean Connery had retired. And Sean Connery is one of those guys that, like, when he retired, he's kind of like Joe Pesci. Though Pesci's about to do a new movie, but he's like, Tully. Oh, it's Ghostbusters. He retired.
Oh, yeah.
Rick Moranis.
Rick Moranis.
He's like Rick Moranis. He retired, and that was it. Like, he didn't do the Jordan-style retiring. He, like, really retired. So he was not coming out of retirement for Indiana Jones and the block of the Mysterians. No chance. Indiana Jones and the Attack of the Atomic Ants, which was one of the
I wonder if he ever got those scripts and was like, what the hell did they just send me?
And he probably would. He probably just threw it away,
Probably didn't even read it.
I remember when they were in pre-production on this flick, Spielberg said, this is going to be just like the others, practical effects, no CGI. I sat down and started watching this thing in the theater because I wanted to see it in theater. I mean, Indiana Jones is back. Yeah. I was 8 years old when I saw him on the big screen, and now I'm like 20 something, and I want to see him on another big screen. And I'm sitting there going, that's CGI'd as fuck. Look at that sky. What is that? Because unlike, and I'm sure a lot of this came from George. Because George Lucas went on the set of Gangs of New York with Martin Scorsese. Scorsese had built the 5 points of New York at period correct for the film. And George walked on the set and was like, we could do all this digitally. You didn't have to waste all this time building this stuff. So with that sort of attitude, I'm sure George was pushing for the sky in every scene in, Crystal Skull to be CGI. You don't have to CGI the sky.
Match the sky of that particular date.
That's, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, the James Cameron thing from Titanic.
Yeah.
And then they walk into that warehouse, which you find out from Raiders is Area 51. CGI is fun. It looks like a video game. So much of this movie looks like a video game. And it's sort of sad. The ants, they CGI'd the ants. When they're going through the jungle, driving a fucking Jeep through the jungle, they CGI'd the Jeep and the jungle. It's like, why don't you just drive through the jungle? I mean,
yeah, like you used to do.
Part of this came from, I'm not letting Spielberg off the hook, because part of this was he said he's not leaving the country because he wanted to be closer to his kids. So I don't know if you can find a jungle.
He also remembered Tanzania, so
Yeah, he's like, I'm not going back there. You could have gone to Hawaii, though. I mean, that's technically not leaving the country. But instead, they created it on a computer screen with a lot of great. That they had this. All right, I don't know how deep I'm going to go into this, but they put his kid in the movie. Okay, Indiana Jones's kid, Mutt, and Mutt is played by an actor named Shia LaBeouf, and so I'm a huge fan of Shy.
I could tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's terrible. It was during that time period when Spielberg was giving him a career, handed him a career. He said, I'll produce Disturbia, I'll produce Transformers, and I'm going to put you in Indiana Jones. And Shia was like, okay, and then later complained about it.
Yes.
Which is very grateful.
And tick Spielberg off, I guess.
Oh, yeah, I would not, if I was Shia LaBeouf, I would not expect Spielberg to be producing any more movies for him. I'll put it like that. But
maybe they've, you know.
Patched it up. Well, Harrison Ford said he thought Shia was stupid. He said that it's after the fact. He said, you don't go around and badmouth movies that you're in, especially when they're directed by somebody that it started your career.
Yes.
And I happen to agree with Harrison on that point. I don't agree with him on everything, but the weed and that point, I agree with him on. Now, there are some Lucas ideas like the hot rods that drive at the beginning.
Yeah,
that was George.
He's like, I used to be into hot rods. Let's put it in there.
That's right. And there's another idea is George's too that's not so good as the hot rod, and that's swinging through the jungle with the monkeys.
You know what he should have done? He should have made Harrison Ford digitally younger,
mm-hmm.
and he could have been Falfa from American Graffiti.
Okay.
And the hot rod.
Yeah. Why not? I mean,
why not? We're already doing this.
We're throwing every other random idea into this movie to see what sticks.
And at the end, the spaceship actually holds Luke Skywalker.
Oh yeah, of course, because it's all tied together.
See, here we go.
It's like
we've brought it together.
It's like the ETs in the Senate.
That's right.
This is a shared universe. Yes. Before we started talking about the other shared universes out there, at least the one successful one, and all the other ones that tried. But this movie, I mean, I don't even know how much further we should go into it. There's a lot of stuff that has become infamous, like the refrigerator. Indy climbs into a refrigerator. That whole town with the nuclear test in the desert, George Lucas idea. Like, that just has George Lucas written all over it. I can see him sitting there and go, Steven, at one point, he ends up in a town. He looks around, there's mannequins. And then there's
Picture it.
And he makes the little thing like that, And there's a nuclear bomb out there, and he starts to hear the countdown. And you know what he does then, Steve? He climbs in a refrigerator, and it blows up. But not Indy. You see the guys driving away and they die, but you see this refrigerator fly over their car and land, and then he pops out. Isn't that a great idea, Steve? And at this point, Steve is just like, whatever, George. Okay,
we're just gonna get this made.
Yeah.
We just.
He's like, we went off the rails a long time ago, George. Sure, refrigerator. Let's do that. I don't know why Indiana Jones was a secret agent for the government when he clearly distrusted the government at the end of Raiders, and then he became a double agent. Yeah. I'm not quite sure how that fits in, but then again, I'm not sure how a lot of this fits in with the other series.
Because why was he an agent? I don't know.
I have no idea. It's just a really bizarre. There are a lot of really bizarre ideas. But this movie, a lot of people wanted to see it. It made a lot of money. It was the second highest grossing movie of 2008 behind The Dark Knight, which, I mean, Dark Knight made $1 billion. So it's kind of hard to beat that. Yeah. But Indiana Jones was right in number 2 there. And, I was telling you beforehand, George Lucas, I remember seeing an interview right before the movie came out. And George is talking. He's so beaten down from the prequels.
I love that you say that.
He really is. And I think he's just so bitter, and he's like, doesn't care that he's ruining shit for people. He's like, I tell you what, you're going to mess with me, I'm going to mess with you. And you guess what? I got the money to do it. I own the cameras, baby. And he sits down with this interviewer, and this interviewer's asking about the movie, and George goes, you know what? Let me just tell you guys, you're not going to like it. He goes,
I'm sure Spielberg loved that.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah. He's like, let me just tell you, when you go into this movie, you ain't going to like anything in it. And I'm like, well, George, I appreciate your honesty. But you're only a few years away from getting rid of all of this and selling it to Disney. You could see the seeds starting to be planted in that interview for Crystal Skull. Because I still say the reason he sold that is because he just wanted to get rid of all these damn fans. He's like, I got museums to build, guys. Leave me alone. So that's what he went off and did. But anyway, even in spite of all of this, we have talks of another Indiana Jones, hopefully without Shia LaDouche.
Yes.
But I tell you, as of the making of this show, Harrison Ford is 77 years old. Harrison Ford can't walk onto a film set without breaking something. So if you guys are going to make this Indiana Jones 5,
do it quick.
Might we suggest you jump on it?
I got a title. Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of Geritol.
Indiana Jones in the retirement home. We could go on forever with those jokes. I think we've kind of reached the pinnacle of our Indiana Jones show. How could we end on any higher a note than that? We'll see if Indiana Jones returns. I am not waiting on bated breath, I must admit.
He may not return.
He may not return. Not in the guise of Harrison Ford, anyway. I'm sure years from now they'll, do the whole reboot thing, because I think Disney owns it now, right?
Yes.
They own Lucasfilms, which would include Indy. So we'll see how it goes.
Unless there's a thing in the contract, like with Star Wars, you cannot reboot.
Right. Oh, you can't reboot, right? Yeah.
I doubt that, because you have young Indiana Jones. I don't know how that would work.
I don't know. We'll find out.
We'll see.
But anyway, until next time, guys, I'd like to thank you for joining this spirited conversation about Indiana Jones. Thank you, Rebecca, for being here.
You're welcome. And George Lucas took a beating.
Yeah, but anyway, we really love you guys, and we're glad that you watched. So we'll see you next week. Take care of yourselves.